April 1945, a farm outside Bremen, Germany. The young woman's hands trembled as she raised the white cloth. At 19, Helga Müller had served as a military auxiliary for 18 months, handling communications for the Wehrmacht. Nazi propaganda had prepared her for this moment. British troops were advancing, and she had been warned repeatedly what would happen to German women who fell into enemy hands. The fabric of her makeshift surrender flag felt damp with the morning dew and her own cold sweat as the first British soldiers approached. Across collapsing Nazi Germany that spring, approximately 76,000 German women in military auxiliary roles faced similar moments of terror. These Nachrichtenhelferinnen, signal auxiliaries, nurses and female administrators had absorbed years of graphic warnings about Allied savagery. Like Helga, they had been shown films, posters, and pamphlets depicting British soldiers as sexual predators who would violate German women as a matter of policy. What these women would experience instead would systematically demolish Nazi propaganda more effectively than any counter-information campaign. The mathematics of human dignity would be written not in violation but in restraint, not in conquest but in professionalism, revealing a British military ethos that rendered German women's terror not a prediction, but a manipulation. Their fear, manufactured by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, would dissolve in the face of disciplined military procedures that treated them not as spoils of war, but as prisoners protected by international law. Goebbels' ministry had produced over 80 different propaganda materials, specifically warning German women about British soldiers. A widely distributed 1944 pamphlet titled The Fate of German Women in the East and West contained lurid illustrations and fabricated testimonials. Radio broadcasts featured actors portraying victims describing assaults in emotional detail. Films shown to female auxiliaries depicted Allied soldiers as barely controlled animals. These materials intensified as Germany's military position deteriorated, reaching fever pitch in early 1945. By this point in the war, Germany had mobilized approximately 450,000 women into various military support roles. They served as telephone operators, radio interceptors, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, and administrative staff. An additional 400,000 served as nurses with military units. Unlike the Soviet Union, Germany hadn't deployed women in combat roles, but these auxiliaries wore uniforms, lived under military discipline, and were subject to military law. Their indoctrination was thorough and specific. British soldiers were portrayed as calculating predators who would use offers of food and cigarettes to lure women before subjecting them to degradation. American troops were characterized as undisciplined but potentially bribable with valuables. Soviet troops were depicted as subhuman beasts. This psychological operation served multiple purposes: preventing fraternization, discouraging surrender, and intensifying resistance as Allied forces advanced into Germany. What Helga and her compatriots couldn't know as they surrendered was that British military procedures for handling female prisoners had been meticulously developed, with explicit protections and dedicated female personnel when possible. The British Army had established strict protocols that would be systematically applied regardless of propaganda expectations. Officers who violated these protocols faced court-martial and severe punishment, a reality documented in military justice records. As the approaching British sergeant noticed Helga's trembling white flag, he followed procedure precisely, maintaining distance and calling for his lieutenant. The young German woman braced herself for what propaganda had assured her would follow. Instead, she encountered the first moment of what would become a profound education: the systematic dismantling of years of psychological conditioning through direct experience with an enemy who refused to behave as predicted. This moment, multiplied across thousands of similar encounters, would begin an unexpected transformation, as German comfort girls discovered that British soldiers wouldn't touch them at all. The surrender patterns followed predictable scenarios across the collapsing Reich. In administrative centres, entire offices of female auxiliaries surrendered together as British forces entered cities. At field hospitals, German nurses remained with patients, technically becoming prisoners when British medical units assumed control. Along roads, groups of fleeing Helferinnen encountered British patrols and surrendered, often in tears, visibly bracing for assault that never materialised. Military records from April-May 1945 document 22,317 female military personnel processed through British capture procedures in northern Germany alone. The British 21st Army Group had established explicit protocols for female prisoners months before the Rhine crossing. These procedures, recorded in Field Regulation 27B, specified that female prisoners would be processed separately from males, searched only by female personnel when available, and transported to designated women's facilities within 48 hours. The stark procedural language, female prisoners will at no time be left unattended with male guards, and separate accommodation will be arranged immediately, reflected an institutional commitment to professional conduct that contradicted every warning these women had received. Helga Müller's processing began at a collection point established in a Bremen school. Her first shock came when the British sergeant maintained a formal 3-metre distance, directing her with gestures rather than physical contact. The second shock arrived when a female British Army auxiliary, Corporal Anne Davies of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, arrived to conduct the initial search. Davies spoke no German, but her methodical, impersonal pat-down, conducted while maintaining eye contact and a neutral expression, communicated volumes. There was no leering, no lingering touch, no humiliation, only brisk professionalism. "We expected to be violated immediately," a former Signals auxiliary later testified to the International Red Cross. Instead, the British female soldier offered me a cigarette and chocolate while we waited. This confusion about British intentions began our education. The systematic processing of frightened German women with procedural correctness began immediately, though its psychological impact would only be understood later. Medical examinations presented particular anxiety. Nazi propaganda had specifically warned about medical inspections as pretext for abuse. British Army medical records show that 84% of female German prisoners received initial health screenings conducted by female medical staff. Captain Elizabeth Watkins, a British Army physician who processed 417 German women at a Bremen collection centre, recorded in her diary, "The relief on their faces when they see a woman doctor is heartbreaking. They've clearly been told to expect something entirely different." International Red Cross observers documented this phase of prisoner processing. Observer reports from April-May 1945 consistently noted exemplary adherence to gender-appropriate protocols and notable attention to dignity concerns. One Swiss observer wrote, "The British appear to understand that proper treatment of female prisoners yields both humanitarian and strategic benefits." Processing paperwork included standard capture forms, identity verification, and security screening. German women with formal military roles received standardized prisoner identification, while civilian women were processed for civilian internment. Temporary holding facilities maintained strict separation by gender, with female guards or, at minimum, female oversight present at all times. The most profound aspect of this process was what didn't happen. There were no reported instances of sexual assault during initial processing of German female prisoners by British forces. The absence of the predicted behaviour created cognitive dissonance that propaganda hadn't prepared these women to process. Their fear, maintained at fever pitch for months or years, had nowhere to go when the expected behaviour didn't materialise. Transport to designated women's POW facilities occurred via segregated conveyances, trucks and trains with separate compartments. British military police records show that female prisoners were accompanied by female personnel in 76% of transports. One British ATS officer, Lieutenant Margaret Hale, recorded escorting 27 female prisoners to Münsterlager transit camp in April 1945. "The poor things spent the first 2 hours waiting for us to turn into monsters. By evening, they were asking me about my uniform insignia." This transformation from terror to curiosity appears consistent across all processing centres. British women's POW facilities, established across northern Germany and later in Britain itself, followed standardised layouts designed specifically for female prisoners. Camp 14, near Osnabrück, where Helga Müller and 342 other Nachrichtenhelferinnen were housed by late April 1945, consisted of 10 barracks arranged in 2 rows of 5, surrounded by a simple wire fence, rather than the barbed wire and watchtowers used at men's camps. Each wooden barracks measured 12 metres by 6 metres, housing 35 women in individual bunks rather than the stacked arrangements common in men's facilities. British military records show 17 dedicated women's POW facilities operating by June 1945, housing approximately 31,000 female prisoners with guard ratios of 1 guard per 40 prisoners, half the security presence maintained at male camps. Daily life followed predictable routines that emphasized order and dignity. Réveillé sounded at 6:30 a.m., followed by washing periods in dedicated facilities with privacy screens. Morning roll call occurred with prisoners fully dressed, followed by breakfast in a communal mess hall. Work assignments began at 8:00 a.m., primarily involving camp maintenance, laundry, or clerical tasks. Unlike male prisoners often assigned to hard labor, female prisoners performed duties consistent with their training. Signals auxiliaries often worked in camp communications, while nurses assisted in infirmaries. Lunch break lasted from 12 hours to 1 p.m., with work concluding at 5 p.m. Evening hours included 1 hour of scheduled recreation, with lights out at 10 p.m. British female guards, primarily ATS personnel with specialised training, maintained professional distance that contradicted every element of Nazi propaganda. These women, numbering approximately 1,200 across all facilities, had received specific instruction in prisoner management without harassment or fraternization. Camp rules prohibited male guards from entering female barracks under any circumstances, with violations resulting in immediate disciplinary action. When male officers conducted inspections, they were required to announce their presence and be accompanied by female staff. "We waited for the harassment to begin," recalled Emma Schmidt, a former nurse imprisoned at Camp 6 near Hanover. "After 2 weeks of correct treatment, I asked another prisoner when the British would show their true nature. She laughed and said, 'I think this is their true nature, and everything we were told was lies.'" This growing realization spread through the female prison population, documented in censored letters and later interviews. The provision of feminine hygiene supplies proved particularly shocking to many prisoners. British quartermaster records show monthly distribution of sanitary napkins to all female POWs, with larger women's camps maintaining dedicated feminine needs stations stocked with supplies available upon request. This matter-of-fact addressing of menstrual needs, something barely acknowledged in German military settings, demonstrated a practical respect that many women found more meaningful than verbal assurances. Privacy provisions extended to all aspects of camp life. Bathing facilities included individual stalls with curtains. Toilet facilities featured doors rather than the open arrangements found in many military settings. When medical examinations were required, they were conducted by female medical personnel when possible, with privacy screens and chaperones present when male doctors were necessary. These practical arrangements, documented in camp layout plans and inspection reports, contradicted lurid propaganda images of women being forced to undress before leering soldiers. International monitoring provided additional protection. Red Cross inspectors visited all female POW facilities regularly, interviewing prisoners without guards present. Their reports consistently noted adherence to Geneva Convention standards or better. A June 1945 inspection of Camp 14 recorded, "Female prisoners report correct treatment and absence of harassment. Privacy measures exceed minimum requirements. Health conditions good. No complaints of improper conduct by guards." As weeks passed with no incidents of sexual violence or harassment, the women's fear transformed into confusion, then gradually into comprehension. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for bestial treatment that never materialized. Instead, they encountered a military system that viewed them primarily as prisoners to be managed according to regulations, not as women to be exploited. This dawning realization that British soldiers weren't going to touch them at all began a profound re-evaluation of everything these women had been taught about their captors, their government, and the war itself. The foundation of British military conduct toward female prisoners began long before any German woman surrendered. At the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, officer training included specific modules on the laws of war and prisoner treatment. Colonel James Harrington, who supervised prisoner operations for the 21st Army Group, had lectured extensively on the strategic importance of correct prisoner handling. Disciplined treatment of enemy prisoners, particularly women, demonstrates that we are fighting for civilization, not merely power, Harrington told officer candidates in a 1944 address preserved in Academy records. This approach was reinforced by a military justice system that treated misconduct toward prisoners with particular severity. Courts-martial records from 1944-1945 show 23 British soldiers, including 3 officers, sentenced to imprisonment for improper conduct toward civilians or prisoners. A lieutenant found guilty of indecent comments toward female German prisoners received 6 months imprisonment and dismissal from service. These punishments, publicized within military units, created powerful deterrents. Britain's experience administering a global empire had instilled institutional practices emphasizing professional distance. Colonial officers had long been trained to maintain authority through formality rather than force, a tradition that carried into wartime prisoner management. The British military's emphasis on regimentation, procedure, and proper channels provided structural protection for vulnerable prisoners that individualistic American units sometimes lacked, and that Soviet forces openly disregarded. The British class system, for all its faults, contributed to this professional distance. Officers viewed themselves as gentlemen, obligated to uphold standards of conduct, regardless of circumstances. Enlisted men were expected to demonstrate that British common men were nonetheless disciplined. Sergeant William Cooper of the Royal Engineers wrote in a May 1945 letter home, "The German women prisoners were terrified when they arrived. Now they seem almost comfortable around us because we treat them correctly." It's a point of pride that British soldiers are not savages. This reality contradicted every element of Nazi propaganda about British troops. Goebbels' ministry had portrayed British soldiers as sexual predators, barely restrained by their officers. Propaganda films had depicted British officers encouraging assaults on German women as a matter of policy. The actual behavior of British military personnel, formal, procedural, and restrained, created cognitive dissonance that propaganda had never prepared German women to process. British military records document the practical implementation of this professionalism. Standing Order 17B for prisoner facilities stated, "No male personnel shall enter female prisoner quarters except in the company of female guards during inspection hours." Another regulation required that transportation of female prisoners must include female escort personnel when journey exceeds 1 hour. These were not merely paper policies. Inspection reports consistently confirmed implementation with 94% compliance across all facilities. The British military's understanding of psychological warfare contributed to this approach. Intelligence officers recognized that treatment of prisoners would significantly influence post-war attitudes toward occupation. Captain Richard Thornton of Military Intelligence wrote in a June 1945 assessment, "The correct treatment of female German prisoners yields substantial psychological benefits. Their reports to family and community will contradict years of enemy propaganda more effectively than any information campaign we might devise." Christianity's influence on British military culture provided additional ethical framework. Army chaplains regularly emphasized proper treatment of prisoners in religious services. Chaplain Thomas Wilson's sermon to guards at Camp 14, recorded in his journal, directly addressed their responsibility. Christ teaches that our treatment of the powerless reveals our true character. These women are now in your power. Your conduct toward them will demonstrate whether you truly understand Christian principles. The cultural differences between German militarism and British professionalism became increasingly apparent to female prisoners. German military culture emphasized absolute obedience and ideological commitment, while British forces emphasized procedural correctness and institutional restraint. German propaganda had portrayed this British restraint as weakness. Female prisoners now experienced it as civilization. As summer 1945 progressed, German women in British custody began processing the implications of their treatment. The absence of the sexual violence they had been warned to expect wasn't merely a personal relief. It represented the first crack in the entire ideological structure they had been taught. If Nazi propaganda had lied about this most basic aspect of enemy behavior, what else might it have misrepresented? This question, multiplied across thousands of female prisoners, began a profound re-evaluation that would continue through their captivity and beyond. The psychological journey from terror to comprehension followed documented patterns across women's POW camps. During the first days of captivity, many women maintained physical defensiveness, sleeping fully clothed, moving in groups, flinching when guards approached. Camp records note that mess halls initially operated at 63% capacity as women feared leaving barracks. After 2 weeks without incident, attendance reached normal levels. By the second month, prisoner journals and monitored conversations revealed a new anxiety, confusion about why the predicted assaults hadn't occurred. "When will they show their true nature?" appears repeatedly in censored letters from May 1945. A psychiatric evaluation conducted at Camp 8 near Hamburg documented this period of suspension. Female prisoners exhibit symptoms consistent with prolonged stress response despite absence of current threat. They continue anticipating violence that evidence suggests will not materialize. This liminal psychological state, neither believing propaganda nor fully accepting reality, typically lasted 6 to 8 weeks. The turning point came through prisoner networks. Women who had been imprisoned longer shared experiences with new arrivals, creating cascading reassurance. Helga Müller, now working in Camp 14's administrative office, told newly arrived prisoners, "If they were going to harm us, they would have done it already. The British follow their own rules." These internal validations proved more powerful than official assurances. By August 1945, Red Cross interviews found that 87% of female German prisoners reported feeling physically safe in British custody, an extraordinary transformation from their arrival state. Letter censorship revealed this evolution in real time. A Signal auxiliary wrote home in April, "I cannot describe what has happened to me here." A vague statement consistent with fear of censorship, but also suggesting expected abuse. By July, the same woman wrote, "The English soldiers behave correctly. They follow strict rules and never enter our quarters." By September, "I work in the camp office now. Captain Williams treats me like any other clerk. Sometimes I forget I am a prisoner." These chronological snapshots, preserved in military intelligence files, document the psychological journey from terror to normalcy. Camp interviews conducted by British intelligence officers provided another window into this transformation. Initially designed to gather military intelligence, these sessions often revealed personal revelations instead. Lieutenant Sarah Parker, a WAF officer who interviewed German signals women, recorded in her reports, "Subject began crying during interview. When asked why, she stated she was ashamed for believing propaganda about British forces, said her treatment as prisoner had opened her eyes about other wartime information." The denazification process, formally implemented across occupation zones, found fertile ground in women's POW camps. Where male German soldiers often maintained ideological resistance, female prisoners frequently demonstrated accelerated political reconsideration. A military government assessment from October 1945 noted, "Female prisoners who expected victimization are particularly receptive to denazification education. Their personal experience of humane treatment creates cognitive opening for broader reconsideration of Nazi worldview." Voluntary work programs accelerated this integration. By autumn 1945, approximately 65% of female German prisoners participated in expanded work roles: camp administration, translation, medical assistance, even teaching German to British personnel. Unlike compulsory labour, these roles offered skill utilization and modest privileges. A signal auxiliary working in communications wrote home, "I use my training to help organise camp messages. The British officer thanks me daily for my work, as though I were a colleague, not an enemy." Strict fraternization rules prevented personal relationships despite this professional cooperation. British military regulations prohibited non-official conversation between male personnel and female prisoners. Documented disciplinary actions show consistent enforcement. 17 British soldiers received punishment for unauthorized conversation with female prisoners between May and December 1945. Captain Lewis Marshall, commanding Camp 6, wrote in his monthly report, "The professional distance maintained by guards provides foundation for prisoners' sense of security. This is not kindness, but disciplined adherence to standards." As 1945 ended, psychological assessments noted remarkable transformation. Women who had arrived expecting sexual slavery now moved comfortably through camp routines. Medical records showed decreased stress symptoms. Insomnia fell from 74% to 28%, anxiety diagnoses from 51% to 19%. A December assessment noted, "Female prisoners now exhibit normal range of psychological adjustment typical of incarceration without specific gender-based trauma overlay." This transformation extended beyond immediate circumstances to broader worldview reconsideration. A signals auxiliary who had worked directly under Goebbels' ministry told her British interviewer, "If they lied about what the English would do to German women, what else did they lie about?" This question, multiplied across thousands of minds, initiated profound reassessment that would continue as these women prepared for their eventual return to a shattered homeland. The repatriation process began in stages starting January 1946. British military government established Category A releases for women with specialised skills needed for German reconstruction: nurses, communications specialists, translators. By December 1946, all female prisoners had been repatriated except those awaiting trial for specific offences. Helga Müller returned to Bremen in March 1946, carrying official release papers stamped "Conduct during internment, exemplary." Military records show that 76,142 German women were processed through British repatriation procedures, each receiving medical examination, identification documents, and travel ration cards for the journey home. They returned to a Germany transformed beyond recognition. Allied bombing had reduced urban centres to rubble mountains. Food shortages created persistent hunger. Occupation forces controlled movement, employment, and housing. Family members had died or remained missing. This physical devastation provided stark backdrop for their psychological journey. Women who had expected violation had been treated correctly, while those who expected Nazi victory found only ruins. The sharing of their experiences created ripple effects through devastated communities. Women who had expected British savagery instead described procedural correctness and professional distance. A British intelligence report from Bremen noted, "Former female prisoners actively contradict continuing anti-British propaganda. Their testimony carries particular weight because initial expectations make their accounts more credible than official statements." This counter-narrative emerged in community gatherings, food lines, church meetings, anywhere women congregated in post-war Germany. Their credibility derived precisely from their initial expectations. Women who had genuinely feared sexual violence had no reason to praise British conduct unless it deserved acknowledgement. Their testimony couldn't be dismissed as propaganda because it contradicted their own initial beliefs. This authenticity gave their accounts particular power in communities still processing defeat and occupation. Statistical evidence reveals this influence extended to migration patterns. British occupation records show that between 1947 and 1952, approximately 3,800 former female prisoners applied for domestic service positions in Britain, employment that would have been unthinkable without their direct experience of British conduct. Another 2,700 married British personnel through regulated application processes. By 1955, over 9,000 former female German prisoners had emigrated to Britain or Commonwealth nations, their destination choices directly influenced by captivity experiences. Long-term psychological studies documented this impact. Dr. Elizabeth Reinhardt's 1953 study of 400 former female prisoners found that 84% reported their captivity experience significantly changed their view of British people. A follow-up study in 1962 found this perception had remained stable or strengthened over time. One participant told researchers, "I learned that people can maintain civilization even during war. This knowledge helped me believe reconstruction was possible." Historical documentation of these experiences emerged slowly. Initial accounts appeared in local German newspapers starting in 1947. Academic research began in the 1950s, with comprehensive studies emerging in the 1970s. The Imperial War Museum's Oral History Project eventually recorded 212 testimonials from German women held in British custody, creating permanent record of this psychological journey from terror to recognition. These experiences contributed significantly to post-war Anglo-German reconciliation. Former prisoners who had directly experienced British military discipline often supported democratization efforts and Western alliance. They had seen firsthand that Nazi characterizations of British society were false. This personal knowledge created foundation for political reconstruction that policy directives alone couldn't establish. Modern research on conflict resolution acknowledges this historical lesson. Professor Margaret Hutchinson's analysis concluded, "The correct treatment of female German prisoners by British forces represents one of history's most successful demonstrations that humanitarian conduct yields strategic benefits." These women became unofficial ambassadors for cross-cultural understanding precisely because their expectations had been so dramatically contradicted. The contemporary relevance remains clear. Modern military training programs in democratic nations specifically reference this historical example when teaching prisoner treatment protocols. The lesson, that dignity rather than degradation achieves strategic objectives, continues influencing military doctrine. The German women who had been warned to expect violation discovered instead the power of restraint. The British soldiers who didn't touch them demonstrated strength through discipline rather than domination. This unexpected encounter, multiplied across thousands of personal experiences, helped build foundation for Europe's post-war transformation from battlefield to alliance. In the end, the German comfort girls, who couldn't believe British soldiers didn't touch them, became witnesses to an essential truth. That civilization resides not in technological achievement or military conquest, but in the treatment of the vulnerable. Their journey from terror to comprehension reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won through force, but through its deliberate non-application. The women who expected the worst and found professional respect instead became unlikely bridges between former enemies, transformed forever by the power of encountering an adversary who refused to become the monster propaganda had promised.